In late April 1945, east of the Ella River in Germany, the Jeep's engine stopped working. It was quiet as Captain T. Moffett Burris gripped the steering wheel. The dirt and grime on his fingers made them white. Days of battle. The young South Carolina paratrooper looked at a column of German soldiers through the dirty window. He could see cars going on and on for miles. His subordinate and a sergeant, their weapons were ready, but they were nowhere near ready for what was coming. 15,000 Germans were waiting for them. Men in the Panzer Corps who were armed. What happened next would go against every rule of military reasoning. 1 Jeep. 3 American paratroopers, 15,000 enemy soldiers with tanks and weapons, and automatic guns. That's not meant to be possible, but it did happen. Still, within 30 minutes, the whole German army would put down their weapons and not fire a single shot. It wasn't the result of better weapons or smarter strategy. It happened because of a bold bet made by one man and the mental breakdown of an army that is stuck between 2 giants that are moving forward. The road that led to this impossible moment did not. In South Carolina, not Germany. It was born Thomas Moffett Burris on September 22, 1919, in Anderson, South Carolina. He grew up in a mill that made clothes. South American country where quiet drive and hard work defined a generation. Burris became a teacher at Orangeburg High School after finishing from Clemson University. He called himself a laid-back boy from a small town who hadn't been in a fight in years. He had been having a reserve officer commission and being a part of the reserve officer training group at Clemson. It looked like his future. Set. A calm life in the country of South Carolina, teaching history to teens. Then there was Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet was struck by Japanese planes. In a few days, the U.S. went to war with Japan. After a few days, Germany attacked the United States. As of January 1942, Burris was told to report for active service. The teacher joined the Army when she was 22 years old, but Burris didn't want to be a normal soldier. He signed up for the paratroopers, which are an elite airborne military unit that is being turned into a new type of a fighting group. The training was very hard. Men had to work hard at jump school, and boundaries in the mind. A lot of them were head out. Burris did well. He found out something. He had never known that he had something in him. The ability to lead when things get tough. The skill to stay calm even when things were going crazy around him. A readiness to take measured risks that scared people. In April 1942, Burris was sent to the still new 82nd Infantry Division of Airborne. He was the first officer to be sent to the 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Company. The 82nd was known as the All-American Division because of armed people from all 50 states came to fight. Burris was trained with farm boys from Iowa, industry workers, and people from Detroit, Texas, and Brooklyn who work on the docks. They would form one of the strongest fighting groups in U.S. military history when they worked together. The 504th. The Germans who fought the parachute infantry gave them a different name. Devils with loose pants. Someone wrote the name in a diary that was found on the body of a German soldier who had died in the Battle of Anzio. The police officer had written that American parachutists were bad in loose pants and were always more dangerous when they were surrounded by. The loose pants were part of the uniforms of paratroopers and were different from normal infantry pants with straight legs. An enemy who didn't give praise lightly said something very nice about you. By May 1943, the army led by Burris set sail for North Africa. His first jump into battle came as part of the invasion of Sicily on July 9, 1943. The C-47 heavy anti-aircraft fire hit a supply plane, but it bounced back. Screened for tracer shots. Fear and air sickness made her throw up. When the green light flashed, Burris jumped into the dark over enemy land. He landed in an olive field, gathered his platoon that was spread out, and fought his way to the goal. It was the first of how many times he put guys in situations they couldn't handle. It was September 1943 when the invasion of Italy in Salerno. The 504th jumped behind German lines to cause trouble for the enemy. Extra support. Most of the time, Burris's group was outnumbered as they fought for 5 days straight. They were always outgunned, but never lost. Later, Lieutenant General Mark Clark said that the 504th saved the head to Salerno Beach. After that, Anzio came in January 1944. The landing by both land and sea turned into 4 months of hellish trench fighting. American defenses were hit by German artillery. Every day, more people died. Burris was hurt twice, but refused to be taken to the hospital. He saw friends get killed in foxholes that were muddy. He found out that war wasn't about fame. I had to stay alive. He also learned, when everything told the men to give up, how to keep them going. But what makes? In September 1944, Burris's war reached its peak. The Market Garden Operation, British Field. Marshal Bernard Montgomery came up with a big plan to end the war by Christmas. Forces in the air would seize. Builds bridges across the Netherlands so that armed units can drive into Germany. It was the 82nd Airborne. They were told to take the Nemi Bridge over the Wall River. It was a very important goal. Without it, the operation wouldn't work. Burris got the order that would test him on September 20th, 1944. Everything he had learned. His group would cross the Wild River in wide, foldable canvas boats. During the day while being hit by German gunfire and machine guns. After that, they would attack strong places on the far bank. It was an impossible task by any measure. British. The police said it was impossible. Burris's men knew what the chances were. Still, no one said number 26 British attack on canvas. Each boat was 19 feet long and had a plywood bottom and a wooden frame. Move forward. Each boat was made to hold 10 paratroopers and 3 engineers. But they were packed with 16 men, 13 paratroopers, 3 engineers, and 1 woman. There were only 2 or 3 on most boats. There were only 6 paddles instead of the usual 8, so paratroopers had to make do with gun butts as oars. The Wild River was. At the crossing, the road is 400 yards wide. Every part of the approach was controlled by German forces. The crossing began at. It's 2:57 in the afternoon. As the boats left the southern shore, machine gun fire hit them hard. Right away, shells from guns went off in the water. Men screamed and died. Boats flipped over. The water was red. In one of the 2, Burris was in charge of I Company, the first wave's lead boats. His boat was hit several times in a matter of seconds. The Private First Class Willard Jenkins, who was the engineer in charge of the boat, was killed by a 20mm shell that hit him in the head and broke it. About a third of the way across the river, his brains and blood fell into Burris's lap. Broken glass from the same. Burris was hurt in the ribs by the blast. Men fell on top of him. The sides of the canvas tore open. It got wet. They were going down. Burris told his men to keep pushing. It was hellish for 15 to 20 minutes of the journey. They got to the far bank with 6 men left from 16. Half of his group died at that crossing. There are only 13 boats from the first wave hit the northern shore without any damage. Between 24 and 48 people were killed in the attack as a whole. About 70 people were badly hurt. They made it across, though. Due to murderous burst of fire, Burris gathered the survivors. They charged the German lines and fought hand-to-hand in the trenches. Grenades and swords. There was no pity asked for or given. They went inch by inch. Fought their way into the land. They had control of the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge by the time it got dark. The British tanks were supposed to take advantage of their success right away. For Sherman tanks from the 2nd Grenadier Guards crossed the bridge around 7 o'clock at night, but they stopped. Burris did not move from the bridge. The tanks did not move forward. A British captain of a tank, Captain Peter Carrington, they told Burris they couldn't move forward without orders and because a single German anti-tank gun was in the way. Burris lost half his business when that bridge was taken, so he blew up with anger. I just gave up half of myself, of my company in front of thousands of guns, and you won't move for 1 gun. A number of American soldiers. After that, many people, including Major Cook, Colonel Tucker, and General Gavin himself, tried to get the British to move forward. All of them failed. The tank stayed. It stayed still for 18 to 24 hours and didn't move until 11 a.m. on September 21st. At that point, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's company at Annam had arrived. Bridge, 11 miles away, had been taken over. The brave British paratroopers who were forced to give up when they needed help. A few years later, Lord Carrington, who later, in his autobiography, the British Foreign Secretary disputed the fight, saying that it did not happen as described, but multiple reports from American paratroopers back up the event and the intense anger. There were military reasons for the British to stop. not having enough ammo and fuel, infantry assistance, and an open, elevated dike road that tanks can't use. The split was caused by different military attitudes and the aggressive paratrooper way of life, opposed to by-the-book guards. Burris got the Silver Star for crossing the Wall River. The quote is, hailed his bravery and brilliant leadership in protecting the north end of the important Megan Highway bridge. But Burris knew what was really going on. Being brave did not win that fight. Audacity meant being ready to do things that seemed impossible, being able to gamble when the odds were against you. 6 months from now, these lessons would still help him. The battle began in December 1944. Of the Bulge, Hitler's last, frantic attack came through the forest of Ardennes. The 82nd Airborne Division rushed into fight without enough food, weapons, or warm clothes for the winter. They were sent to Vermont, Belgium, and stopped a group of paper campers at Chenot, giving their first loss in the Battle of the Bulge. Burris and his men stayed put in the face of German tanks. A battery. They fought when it was below zero outside. They were hit over and over again, but they didn't break. In February 1945, they were moving into Germany. The last few months of the war turned into a race. From the east, Soviet troops moved forward. American and the British came from the west and drove. Germany was being wiped out by two huge forces. Hitler's 1,000-year plan. Reich broke apart in a fiery mess. It wasn't over yet, though. English units that were stuck between the advancing Allies fought with all the zeal of men who knew they were going to lose. In May, the 82nd Airborne Division freed the Vubelen prison camp on February 2, 1945, close to Ludwigslust. What Burris and his men found there was hard to understand. Pretty much. Between 3,500 and 4,000 prisoners were just skin bodies that were barely alive. About 1,000 dead bodies were found in open pits. Some proof of cannibalism. Among the hungry, there was a terrible smell. Men who had fought through 2 years of fighting threw up at the spot. Burris shot a door's lock off to free the prisoners. He was one of the Americans were the first to see the horrible events. He told his soldiers to take pictures of everything to record it. This was important for everyone to see. There had to be proof of what the Nazi government had done. Burris later said, the German prison camp was the American army told the people of Ludwigslust to tour the camp. It was the worst thing I saw during the whole war. German people had to see what was done for them on May 7th. The 82nd Airborne held funerals for 200 people who died in the town square. People in Ludwigslust arrested German officers and a number of other 100 American paratroopers were there, and the division priest gave a very sad speech. The crimes that were done in the name of the German people and with their permission were not as bad as those that happened in other. There are no gas chambers or crematoriums here like there were in German prison camps. It wasn't that these guys from France, Russia, Holland, and Poland were bad. 4,000 people were left to die of hunger just 4 miles from your nice houses. For men, life was like being an animal. Burris stood at attention during the service. He had seen terrible things in. Friends were torn apart by gunfire, men drowned in the wild river, and the house of Anzio was a terrible place to be. But Vobelin was the best, and that camp showed how bad people really are. He knew then that beating them would be the hardest part. It wasn't enough for Germany. The whole world had to make sure this never happened again. In late April 1945, Allied commanders had to make a big choice. The Soviet troops were coming up behind Berlin from the east. American troops had reached the Elbe River from the west. The American troops were told to stop at the Elbe River so that Soviet forces could take Berlin by Commander Dwight Eisenhower. At the Yalta meeting, political plans for Germany after the war were already made. Berlin would fall. In the area occupied by the Soviets, there was no military reason for American troops to fight their way into a city. But the Soviets were going to get it anyway. Burris didn't like the order, though. He was 25 years old and had been fighting for almost 3 years. Berlin was some 40 miles away. The war was almost over, and he was told to just wait. Wasn't like Burris at all. He liked to take action, and waiting was torture for him. It's not clear exactly when, but Burris made a choice one day in late April. Thought back to telling his captain and sergeant, I can't take this any longer. Let's drive in my car. Let's cross the river and see what we can find. Check to see if there are still a lot of people over there. It wasn't an official order. In no way was it an approved reconnaissance. 3 parachutists in a jeep were going into enemy land because Burris was bored and interested. They drove about 40 miles, which is about halfway to Berlin. The roads were crowded with people trying to get away from the Soviet approach. German people pushed carts that were full of their things. Kids cried. Old people were so tired that they stumbled along. In Germany, the social order had totally broken down. The authority not longer existed. Everything was controlled by fear. Then Burris saw something ahead on the road. He felt something that froze his blood. Military cars made in Germany. Dozens of them. No, 100. As far as he could see, there was a whole column. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery, trucks that carry troops, and supply trucks. This was not a bunch of deserters spread out. This was a well-organized military group. A full corps of Panzer. Most likely at least 15,000 troops. Burris should have turned around right away. 3 men in a jeep had no business confronting an armored corps. The smart play was to retreat, report the enemy position, and let division headquarters decide how to handle it. But Burris did not become one of the most decorated officers in the 82nd Airborne by always making the cautious choice. He had a different idea, a crazy idea, an idea that made no logical sense whatsoever, but it just might work. He drove straight toward the German column. His lieutenant and sergeant said nothing, but both men checked their rifles. If this went wrong, they would go down fighting. The jeep rolled up to the lead vehicle in the column. A German officer stood beside it. Burris noticed the man wore a captain's insignia. He spoke English. That was lucky. Burris climbed out of the jeep and walked directly to the German captain. He kept his hand away from his sidearm. No aggressive moves, just confidence. Pure absolute confidence. I am here to accept your surrender, Burris announced. His voice was steady, matter of fact, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if he had not just driven 40 miles behind enemy lines with 2 other men to confront 15,000 German soldiers. The German captain stared at him in disbelief. He looked past Burris to the jeep. 2 men, 1 vehicle, no supporting troops, no tanks, no artillery, nothing. The captain's face registered confusion, then suspicion, then something approaching amusement. He gestured at the jeep and the 2 Americans waiting beside it. Are you crazy? He asked in heavily accented English. 3 men and a jeep? It was a fair question. Burris was indeed taking an extraordinary risk, but this was not a moment for rational assessment. This was a moment for audacity, for the kind of bluff that Burris had been perfecting since he jumped into Sicily 2 years ago. He looked the German captain straight in the eye. I have a whole army of paratroopers and tanks right behind me, Burris said calmly. And the Russians are right behind you. Do you want to surrender to us or to them? It was a magnificent lie. There was no army of paratroopers behind Burris. There were no tanks. There was nothing but the same empty road they had driven down. But the German captain did not know that. And more importantly, the German captain desperately wanted to believe there might be an American army nearby, because if there was not, his only option was to surrender to the Soviets. And every German soldier knew what that meant. The Soviet Red Army had suffered unimaginable casualties fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. Over 20 million Soviet citizens died in the war. The Soviets had seen their cities burned, their people enslaved, their nation nearly destroyed. They advanced into Germany with a hunger for vengeance that terrified German troops. Stories circulated of mass executions, brutal treatment of prisoners, and systematic reprisals. True or not, German soldiers believed them. The prospect of Soviet captivity was a nightmare that haunted every Wehrmacht officer. American captivity, by contrast, seemed almost civilized. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention. They treated prisoners humanely. They did not execute officers on sight. The German captain knew all this. As he stood in the road looking at Burris, he faced a choice. He could call the Americans' bluff, order his men to disarm these 3 paratroopers, continue the retreat toward wherever they were going, and eventually fall into Soviet hands. Or he could accept what this confident young captain was offering: a chance to surrender to the Americans, a chance to avoid the Red Army, a chance, however slim, to survive this war. The German captain said, "Wait a minute." He turned and walked back. Down the column, Burris watched him gather 3 or 4 other German officers. They formed a small group beside one of the vehicles and began an animated discussion. Burris could see them gesturing. Some pointed toward him. Others pointed east toward the Soviet lines. The debate continued for several minutes. Burris stood perfectly still, his face a mask of confidence. Inside, his heart pounded. This could go either way. Finally, the German captain broke away from the group and walked back to Burris. His hand moved to his holster. Burris tensed. The lieutenant and sergeant in the jeep raised their rifles slightly. This was it. Either surrender or combat. The German captain pulled his pistol from the holster. For a brief moment, Burris thought, "Oh no, not here in the last few days of the war." The captain held the pistol, pointed it at Burris's heart, then turned it around, grip first, and extended it toward Burris, the universal gesture of military surrender. Burris accepted the pistol. He nodded to the German captain. The captain saluted. Behind him, the word spread down the column. Surrender. The Americans have arrived. We are surrendering. German soldiers began dismounting from vehicles. They stacked their rifles. They removed their sidearms and placed them on the ground. Officers organized their men into orderly groups. The discipline held even in defeat. This was still a professional military force, but it was a defeated one. Burris faced an immediate problem. He had 15,000 German prisoners and no way to guard them or transport them. He had no communication with his division. He had 3 men and 1 jeep. The situation was absurd. He ordered the German officers to maintain control of their troops and begin marching west toward American lines. The Germans obeyed. Burris and his 2 men followed in the jeep, bringing up the rear of the column like shepherds herring sheep. They drove for hours. The column of German soldiers stretched for miles. They passed through destroyed villages and abandoned checkpoints. Occasionally, they encountered American patrols who stared in amazement at the sight. Where did all these prisoners come from? The story spread quickly through American lines. Captain Burris accepted the surrender of an entire Panzer Corps with just a jeep and 2 other men. Nobody could quite believe it. When Burris finally reached 82nd Airborne Headquarters, his colonel was waiting. The colonel was not happy. Burris had defied orders. He had driven into enemy territory without authorization. He had taken unnecessary risks. The colonel did not know whether to court-martial him or commend him. For several days, Burris waited to learn his fate. Some officers argued he had shown dangerous disregard for orders. Others pointed out that he had just captured 15,000 enemy soldiers without firing a shot. In the end, the army decided that results mattered more than procedure. Burris was recommended for commendation rather than punishment. Years later, when asked about the incident, Burris was characteristically modest. "I needed a plan and quick," he said. The plan had been simple. Bluff with absolute confidence. Offer the Germans a choice between 2 outcomes, one of which was clearly preferable, and pray they took the bait. It had worked because Burris understood something fundamental about military psychology. In April 1945, the German army was broken, not just militarily, but psychologically. They knew the war was lost. They knew Hitler's promises were lies. They were terrified of the Soviets and exhausted from years of fighting. All they wanted was a way out. Burris gave them one. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years. The 82nd Airborne Division received the honor of occupation duty in Berlin. General George S. Patton reviewed the paratroopers and bestowed upon the division a new nickname, America's Guard of Honor. Burris stood in formation as Patton addressed them. "You are soldiers who jumped into hell and fought your way out." The war had transformed him. At 25, he was a captain, a veteran of 4 major campaigns, and one of the most decorated officers in the Airborne. But the war had also changed him in ways that would take years to understand. Burris returned to South Carolina after the war. He married, started a family, and entered the construction business. He worked at Roebuck Building Company in Spartanburg, South Carolina for 15 years, before starting his own firm. In 1970, at the urging of his family, Burris founded Burris Construction Company with his 3 sons, John Hay, Moffett Jr., and Francis. The company undertook major construction projects throughout the Southeast. Burris served as president from 1970 to 1987. In 1982, Burris Building Systems was founded as a division, then incorporated as a separate business in 1987 by his son Moffett Burris Jr. from 1977 to 1990. Burris served in the South Carolina House of Representatives representing Richland County. He brought the same leadership skills he learned in combat to civilian politics, direct, honest, focused on results. His constituents appreciated a man who said what he meant and did what he said. He served as minority leader for 9 years and was instrumental in building the modern Republican Party in South Carolina. He was the first minority leader in the State House of Representatives. In 1977, the film A Bridge Too Far told the story of Operation Market Garden. Actor Robert Redford played a composite character based partly on Burris and his actions at Naaman. Burris consulted on the film. Watching the recreation of the Wild River crossing brought the memories flooding back. He could still hear the machine guns, still see his men dying in the boats, still feel the cold water rising as the boat took on more and more hits. In 2000, at age 80, Burris published his memoir, Strike and Hold, a memoir of the 82nd Airborne in World War II. The book was written at the urging and persuasion of his children. In the prologue, he wrote that he needed to come to terms with war by talking about it and reliving it with men who have shared similar experiences. The book became essential reading for military historians and veterans alike. It was a first-hand account of what it meant to lead men in combat, what it cost, what it took, what it left behind. On September 19, 1994, Burris made an airborne jump into Holland for the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. He was 4 days shy of his 75th birthday, technically 74 years old. The jump was organized with Pathfinder Holland reenactment group at the original battle site in Nîmes. 15 years later in September 2009, he returned for the 65th anniversary and made a tandem jump at age 90 strapped to a female jumper from Pathfinder Holland. This 3-day commemoration included a 28-person entourage with family. He was honored by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands and received the Naaman Medal of Honor from the Queen and the Mayor of Nijmegen. The people of Holland had not forgotten. Fresh flowers adorned monuments to the American soldiers who died liberating their country. Dutch children learned in school about the paratroopers who crossed the Wild River under fire. For Burris, those visits were profoundly moving. The war had meaning because it had freed people from tyranny. The sacrifices were not in vain. In 2012, at age 92, Burris spoke at Fort Jackson's quarterly Profession of Arms luncheon for the Army Training Center. For nearly an hour, he held commanders, sergeants, major, and staff spellbound as he recounted his combat experiences. He told them about shooting the lock off a concentration camp gate to free prisoners. He told them about convincing a German Panzer to surrender. He told them about being among the first Americans to enter Berlin after Germany's surrender. The audience sat in absolute silence. They were witnessing history. They were hearing from a man who embodied everything the Army aspired to be. One officer who attended that presentation later said, "What resonated most with me as a commander was the simple message that good leaders need to lead from the front and should never expect anything from their soldiers that they would not do themselves." As a result of his exceptional leadership, his men and others who served near him were able to overcome the insurmountable odds they faced and accomplish the missions they were given even under the difficult conditions they experienced throughout the war. In his later years, Burris spoke frequently about leadership, duty, and service. He addressed military audiences, civic groups, and schools. His message was consistent. Good leaders lead from the front. Never ask your people to do something you would not do yourself. Take care of your troops, and they will take care of you. These were not abstract principles for Burris. They were lessons learned in blood and fire. When asked about the surrender of the 15,000 German troops, Burris always emphasized the context. It was not about him being brave or clever. It was about understanding the situation. Those German soldiers were terrified of the Soviets. They wanted to surrender to the Americans. All he did was give them the Opportunity. Any officer who understood the psychology of the moment could have done the same thing. But few officers had the audacity to try. His full military decorations included the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with Combat V. For Valor, Purple Heart, 3 Presidential Unit citations with 2 oak leaf clusters, French Forager, Belgian Forager, and Dutch Lanyard. The 82nd Airborne Division compiled an extraordinary combat record in World War II. 4 men from the division received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The division earned 4 campaign streamers for action in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Central Europe. It liberated concentration camps, captured thousands of prisoners, and held critical objectives against overwhelming odds. Team Moffett Burris died on January 4, 2019 at age 99. His funeral service drew hundreds of mourners, including veterans who had served with him, politicians who had worked alongside him, and Dutch citizens who flew across the Atlantic to honor the man who helped liberate their country. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster said, "Moffett Burris is one of the finest leaders our state and nation has ever produced. He delivered freedom to people around the world and made the lives of those he touched better and safer." The story of Burris and the German Panzer Corps captured national attention when it was first reported. Newspapers called it one of the most audacious actions of the war. Military historians studied it as an example of psychological warfare and individual initiative. But Burris himself never sought fame for the incident. In interviews decades later, he was almost embarrassed by the attention. He insisted he was just doing his job, just trying to end the war without getting anyone killed. Yet the incident reveals something profound about military leadership and the nature of courage. True courage is not the absence of fear. It is the mastery of fear. Burris was surely afraid when he confronted that German column. Any sane man would be. But he controlled his fear. He projected confidence even when the situation was hopeless. He understood that warfare is ultimately psychological. Weapons matter, numbers matter, but mindset matters most. The German officers who surrendered to Burris were not cowards. They were professionals who recognized when continued resistance was futile. They were caught between 2 superpowers, their nation in ruins, their cause lost. Burris gave them a rational choice. Surrender now to the Americans or be captured later by the Soviets. The fact that his bluff worked says less about his deception and more about the desperation of Germany in April 1945. Some military analysts have questioned whether every detail of Burris's story is entirely precise. 15,000 troops is a suspiciously round number. The details are somewhat vague on exact locations and dates. Burris himself admitted his memory of specific events had faded over the decades. Yet, the core of the story is indisputable. American 82nd Airborne after action. Reports from late April 1945 document large numbers of German prisoners taken, with minimal resistance. Division records note that Captain Burris of I Company 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment was commended for actions involving German surrender. Multiple veterans from his unit recalled hearing about the incident shortly after it occurred. What we know for certain is this. In the final days of the war in Europe, Moffett Burris encountered a large German military formation. Using nothing but confidence and psychological pressure, he convinced them to surrender without a fight. The exact numbers may be uncertain. The precise details may have blurred with time, but the essential truth remains. One man's audacity accomplished what an army might have struggled to achieve through force. The lessons from Burris's experience extend far beyond military history. They speak to fundamental aspects of human psychology and decision-making. When people are trapped between bad options, they will grasp at any hope of a better outcome. When authority figures project confidence, others follow even against their better judgment. When the cost of resistance seems greater than the cost of surrender, rational actors will choose surrender. Burris understood all these principles instinctively. He did not study psychology or negotiation tactics. He simply knew people, and that knowledge combined with extraordinary courage changed the outcome of one small moment in a vast war. The story also illustrates the chaos and fluidity of war's final days. Military historians often focus on grand strategy, major battles, and decisive campaigns. But wars do not end neatly. They dissolve into confusion. Units lose contact with headquarters. Soldiers make decisions without orders. Authority breaks down. In that chaos, individuals like Burris had opportunities to shape events in ways that would be impossible under normal military discipline. Consider what Burris did. He violated direct orders to stay west of the Ella. He drove into enemy territory without support or communication. He confronted a force that outnumbered him thousands to one. He lied about having reinforcements. He should have been killed or captured. Instead, he pulled off one of the most remarkable bluffs in military history. That combination of audacity, confidence, and calculated risk defines exceptional leadership. Compare Burris's action to the British tank commander at Namian. That officer had overwhelming firepower. He had clear orders to advance. All that stopped him was a single German anti-tank gun and his own hesitation. Burris, by contrast, had nothing but a jeep and 2 other men. Yet he succeeded, where the heavily armed tank commander failed. The difference was mindset. Burris understood that in the fog of war, perception matters more than reality. If you can convince the enemy you have overwhelming force, you do not need overwhelming force. In the decades after the war, Burris often reflected on how close he came to death so many times. The jump into Sicily, where he landed under enemy fire. The Salerno campaign, where bullets missed him by inches. The 2 wounds at Anzio that could have been fatal. The wild river crossing that killed half his company. The confrontation with 15,000 German soldiers that could have ended in his execution. At any of those moments, his life could have ended. The fact that he survived all of them seemed almost miraculous to him. But survival was not random luck. Burris survived because he was smart, because he trained harder than most, because he learned from every combat experience, and because he understood that leadership means taking the same risks you ask of your men. Men followed him, not because he ordered them to, but because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. That kind of leadership inspires loyalty that transcends fear. When Burris spoke about the war in his later years, he always emphasized the men he served with rather than his own actions. He talked about the privates who jumped into darkness over Sicily, the sergeants who held their squads together at Anzio, the lieutenants who died leading their platoon across the wall. For Burris, the story was never about him. It was about them, the thousands of young Americans who answered their nation's call, endured unimaginable hardships, and helped defeat tyranny. In 2011, at age 91, Burris spoke to the United States Army Chaplain Basic Officer Leadership Course. In 2017, at age 97, he gave an interview to Fox News, where he recounted his wartime experiences with the same clarity and humility he had shown throughout his life. Even in his final years, he remained committed to sharing the lessons of leadership and sacrifice with new generations. That was Burris's legacy, not the medals or the decorations, not the dramatic stories or the incredible risks. His legacy was the example he set, the standard of leadership he maintained, the way he treated his soldiers with respect and led them with courage. Young officers study his actions today not because they are exceptional in the Hollywood sense, but because they demonstrate what is possible when a leader combines competence with audacity. The Jeep that Burris drove toward that German column no longer exists, scrapped decades ago, like millions of other World War II vehicles. The road where he confronted those 15,000 German soldiers has been rebuilt and modernized. The refugees who fled the Soviet advance are long dead. The German officers who surrendered that day have passed into history. But the story endures. It endures because it captures something essential about the human spirit: the refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to take impossible risks, the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is confidence itself. In the final accounting of World War II, Thomas Moffett Burris was one soldier among 16 million Americans who served. His actions were one incident among countless thousands, but his story illustrates what made the Allied victory possible. It was not just industrial capacity or superior weapons or better strategy. It was individual initiative. It was soldiers like Burris who saw an opportunity seized it without orders, and changed outcomes through pure audacity. When Burris died in 2019, he was one of the last surviving members of his generation. The men who jumped into Sicily are almost all gone now. The paratroopers who crossed the wild river under fire have passed into memory. The veterans who liberated concentration camps and saw the true cost of Nazi ideology are disappearing. Soon all we will have are their stories. Stories like Burris's bluff on a German road in April 1945. That story deserves to be remembered not because it was typical, but precisely because it was not. Most surrenders involved lengthy negotiations, superior force, and clear military advantage. Burris's surrender involved none of that. It was 3 men in a jeep facing 15,000 enemy soldiers. It should not have worked. But Burris was not interested in what should or should not work. He understood that in the chaos of war's end, the old rules no longer applied. He understood that desperate men will believe what they want to believe. He understood that confidence is contagious, and that a bold bluff beats a cautious retreat. So remember this story. Remember the school teacher from South Carolina who became one of the most decorated paratroopers in American history. Remember the captain who jumped 4 times into combat and led from the front in every battle. Remember the man who crossed a river under fire, lost half his company, and kept fighting. Remember the officer who confronted 15,000 enemy soldiers with nothing but nerve and convinced them to lay down their arms. Remember Team Moffett Burris. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear. Remember that leadership means standing where you ask others to stand. Remember that sometimes the impossible is just the improbable waiting for someone audacious enough to try it. Remember that 3 men in a jeep armed only with confidence and a well-timed bluff can change the course of history. That is the lesson of April 1945. That is the legacy of one remarkable American soldier. That is what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and refuse to accept that impossible means the same thing as unable to attempt. The jeep rolled down that German road with 3 men inside. They confronted an army. They should have died. Instead, they won. And in that victory, however small in the vast scope of World War II, we see the true measure of American military success. Not just superior firepower, not just industrial might, but the audacity of soldiers who refused to believe they were outnumbered when they knew they were right.